By the summer of 1944, Germany's empire was crumbling under the weight of total war. The promise of a thousand-year Reich had collapsed into rubble and exhaustion. In the west, Allied troops had broken through Normandy. In the east, the Red Army was closing on Poland. Cities that once cheered the march of victory now burned under daily bombardment. Inside the German High Command, beneath the veneer of obedience, many officers saw what Hitler refused to admit, that defeat was inevitable. Among them was Colonel Klaus Schenk Graf von Stauffenberg, an aristocratic officer from an old Swabian family. Educated, devout, and patriotic, he had served the Reich faithfully. But the years of war and the crimes committed in its name had transformed his loyalty into quiet resistance. In 1943, he returned from North Africa gravely wounded, losing his right hand, 2 fingers of his left, and an eye. His injuries left him unable to fight at the front, but they placed him within the administrative corps of the army, close to the Reserve Army Command in Berlin. Reports of mass executions and scorched earth orders reached his desk. To Stauffenberg, they were proof that Hitler's leadership had become a moral and national catastrophe. Convinced that Germany could survive only if the dictator were removed, he joined a small network of officers and civilians determined to act. The resistance had grown from years of failed attempts and divided hopes, from the suicide of General Trescow's messengers to the quiet plotting of men such as Ludwig Beck and Friedrich Olbricht. Together, they planned to use an existing emergency decree known as Operation Valkyrie. Valkyrie was originally designed to secure control of the Reich if civil unrest broke out. Under the conspirators' revisions, it would serve a different purpose, a legal facade for a coup. Once Hitler was dead, the Reserve Army would mobilize under Valkyrie orders, seize ministries, arrest SS leaders, and restore law and order in the name of a new government. The plan depended on one condition only: Hitler had to be killed. By early July 1944, time was running out. The Gestapo was tightening its grip. Suspicion spread through the ranks. Yet the circle of resistance decided to act. Stauffenberg's position gave him what others lacked: access to Hitler himself. He would attend the Führer's military conferences at the Wolfschanze, the heavily fortified headquarters hidden in the East Prussian forest. There, in the very heart of the regime, he intended to place the bomb that could end it. Morning of 20 July 1944. A Hinkel aircraft carried Stauffenberg and his aide, Lieutenant Werner von Haften, from Berlin to Rostenburg in East Prussia. In his leather briefcase lay 2 blocks of British plastic explosive, detonators and timing pencils concealed among papers.
Officially, he was to brief Hitler on the organization of the Reserve Army. Unofficially, he carried the most dangerous assignment any German officer had ever undertaken: to assassinate the head of state during wartime. The Wolf's Lair was a sprawling compound surrounded by minefields, fences, and watchtowers. Stauffenberg entered shortly before noon, saluted guards, and passed through multiple checkpoints. Hitler, Goering, and Keitel were already waiting in a wooden conference hut instead of the usual concrete bunker, a change made because of the day's intense heat. That change, simple and practical, would prove decisive. At 12:30 p.m., the meeting began. Charts and situation maps covered the long oak table. Stauffenberg, standing close to Hitler, appeared calm. After a few minutes, he excused himself, claiming he needed to take a telephone call. In a nearby side room, he worked quickly. With one functioning hand, he crushed the acid capsule in the pencil fuse and inserted it into a single block of explosive. The copper wire began to burn silently, its chemical reaction allowing roughly 10 minutes before detonation. He had planned to arm a second charge, doubling the blast, but was interrupted. A guard summoned him back to the conference. There was no time. He slipped the armed device into his briefcase and returned to the room. Carefully, he placed it beneath the map table near Hitler's right leg and positioned it upright against one of the thick wooden supports. Then, glancing at his watch, he excused himself once more, stepping outside into the glaring sun. Inside, the discussion continued. An officer, Colonel Heinz Brandt, shifted the briefcase to the far side of the table leg to gain a better view of the maps, a casual movement that would change everything. At 12:42 p.m., the bomb detonated. The explosion tore through the hut, shattering windows, blowing doors from their hinges, and killing 4 men instantly. Stauffenberg, already driving toward the airfield, saw smoke rising behind the trees and believed his mission had succeeded. But Adolf Hitler had survived. Shielded by the heavy table leg and the open windows that vented the blast, he emerged bruised, burned, but alive. Within hours, his voice would reach Berlin, and the fate of the conspirators would be sealed. In Berlin, word of the explosion reached the Bendler Block, headquarters of the Reserve Army, shortly after 1 o'clock. News was confused, but hopeful. Telephone lines crackled with fragments. Hitler dead, Wolf's Lair destroyed. For Colonel Stauffenberg, now airborne back to the capital, it was confirmation enough. From his aircraft window, he watched the forests recede and whispered to his aide, "The Führer is dead. The war is over." General Friedrich Olbricht and his staff wasted no time. They began to activate Operation Valkyrie, distributing coded telegrams to military districts across Germany. The messages declared that the SS had attempted a coup and that the Reserve Army was assuming control to protect the Reich. Orders were dispatched to arrest Heinrich Himmler, Joseph Goebbels, and senior SS commanders. In Paris, General Stulpnagel received the same signal and moved against Gestapo officers there. For a few brief hours, the machinery of the coup began to turn.
At 3 p.m., Stauffenberg's car reached the Bendler Block courtyard. He entered to a mixture of relief and disbelief. Dust from the Wolf's Lair still clung to his uniform. He told the assembled officers that he had seen the blast, that Hitler was surely dead. His confidence steadied the room. With that assurance, the conspirators signed and reissued Valkyrie orders under his authority. Troops in Berlin began securing intersections, blocking entrances to government ministries, and surrounding the headquarters of the Nazi Party. It was, on the surface, the beginning of a new regime. Yet even as they moved, uncertainty spread. Communications with East Prussia were erratic. Some regional commanders demanded proof of Hitler's death before acting. Others hesitated, fearing a trap. And in the Reich Chancellery, Joseph Goebbels sat silently beside his telephone, waiting. He had received no direct word from Hitler, but his instincts told him to stay still, to listen before reacting. By late afternoon, the conspirators had appointed new ministers, drafted radio statements, and prepared proclamations announcing that the government was now under military authority. Outside, curious Berliners watched armored vehicles roll through the streets. Few knew who commanded them or why. The city's air, heavy from weeks of bombing raids, seemed to hold its breath. Inside the Bendler block, Stauffenberg looked at the clock. Every passing minute without confirmation strengthened their hope and their peril. At 4 p.m., that hope began to die. A telephone line from the Wolf's Lair crackled alive. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, Hitler's chief of staff, was on the line, shouting in fury, "The Führer is alive! He is alive and speaking!" In that instant, the illusion collapsed. Within minutes, Goebbels' ministry confirmed the news. Hitler had suffered only minor injuries. Photographs soon followed. The Führer showing his torn trousers and bandaged hand to staff officers, smiling grimly for the cameras as proof of his survival.
Goebbels, ever the propagandist, acted quickly. He phoned the commander of the Berlin Military District, Major General Otto Rehmer, whose troops had been mobilized under Valkyrie orders. Calmly, he told Rehmer to hold the line, then passed the receiver to Hitler himself. Through the crackling connection, Rehmer heard the unmistakable voice, "Do you recognize me?" Rehmer answered, "Yes, my Führer." Hitler's command was short and absolute. Put down the revolt immediately. Rehmer obeyed. His units turned their weapons away from the SS buildings they had been ordered to seize, and instead surrounded the Bendler block. Inside, confusion turned to panic. Officers argued over what to do. Telephone calls from regional commands demanded clarity. Others went silent entirely. Reports flooded in, Valkyrie orders cancelled, troops standing down, arrests reversed. The momentum that had seemed unstoppable an hour earlier now disintegrated. At 10 p.m., loyal officers stormed the offices. Stauffenberg and his remaining allies were arrested after a brief firefight in the corridors. The documents on the tables, the new government decrees, the lists of ministers, the signed Valkyrie orders, lay scattered across the floor, meaningless relics of a revolution that had lasted less than a day. Somewhere far away, in his forest headquarters, Adolf Hitler listened to the news and ordered swift punishment. The vengeance of the Reich would come before morning. Night fell over Berlin, heavy and airless, carrying the uneasy silence that often followed a failed rebellion. Around the Bendler block, searchlights glared across the courtyard, their beams cutting through dust and cigarette smoke. Tanks from Major General Otto Rehmer's regiment stood with engines idling. Inside, the atmosphere was one of disbelief and exhaustion. Only hours earlier, the conspirators had spoken of rebuilding Germany. Now, they faced the collapse of everything: their plan, their honor, and their lives. Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg, still in his field uniform, remained calm.
He refused to accept that Hitler had survived. "It is impossible," he repeated quietly. "The man is dead." But proof was already spreading through the city. Goebbels's announcement on the radio, the photographs, the jubilant reports from the Wolf's Lair. General Ulbricht and Colonel Merz von Quernheim argued for surrender. Others hesitated, fearing the Gestapo's arrival. In the corridors, junior officers whispered in confusion, unsure whom to obey. The lines between loyalty and treason had blurred completely. By 10:30 p.m., Remmer's troops had surrounded the building. The telephone lines were cut, and loyalist officers entered to take control. Gunfire echoed briefly in the courtyard. A few defiant shots, nothing more. Within minutes, the resistance was over. The surviving conspirators, Stauffenberg, Ulbricht, Quernheim, and Werner von Haften, were lined up in an office lit by a single desk lamp. Papers lay strewn across the floor. The final draft of the Valkyrie decree, the unused second bomb, the lists of intended ministers. History's turning point now looked like an untidy office after a long day's work. Shortly after midnight, the four men were led outside to the courtyard. The air smelled of gasoline and dust. No trial, no last words from the regime they had tried to overthrow. Only a brief order from a major commanding the firing squad. Stauffenberg, blindfolded, stood straight despite his wounds. Moments before the shots rang out, he shouted, "Long live our sacred Germany!" The echo of his voice hung in the night for a second before the rifles answered. One by one, they fell. Their bodies were left under the flickering searchlights until morning, before being taken away quietly, without ceremony.
The Bendler block returned to silence. Files were sealed, rooms locked, and guards posted at every door. Outside the building, Berlin stirred in ignorance. Few citizens knew that an attempt had even been made on Hitler's life. But by dawn, the truth would spread, carried by the propaganda machine that never slept. The failed assassination had not saved Germany. Instead, it had given the dictator new strength and a list of names to destroy. At sunrise on 21 July 1944, the Nazi regime moved with ruthless precision. Teleprinters across the Reich broadcasted the official version. A small clique of ambitious officers attempted a treacherous assassination against the Führer. The attempt has failed. Divine providence has protected the leader of the German people. The message was repeated endlessly on radio, accompanied by martial music and Hitler's own voice, hoarse but triumphant, assuring the nation that he had survived by miracle and that the perpetrators would pay. The Gestapo and SS were unleashed without restraint. Orders from Heinrich Himmler authorized immediate arrest and interrogation of anyone connected to the plot. Within hours, thousands of officers, politicians, and civilians were detained. Some were guilty, many were not. Berlin, Munich, and Vienna filled with secret police convoys carrying handcuffed men through the night. Interrogations were brutal and swift. Under torture, names were forced from lips already broken. The web of suspicion grew wider with every confession.
Trials were conducted before the Volksgerichtshof, the People's Court, presided over by Roland Freisler, whose screaming theatrics turned proceedings into spectacles of humiliation. Defendants were brought in with torn uniforms, hands bound, faces bruised. Freisler shouted accusations, mocked their patriotism, and denied them defense. Sentences were predetermined. Hanging was the preferred punishment, slow, public, and recorded on film for Hitler's private viewing. The first executions took place within days. Across Germany, the purges spread. Over 7,000 people were arrested, and nearly 5,000 were executed in the months that followed. Senior officers, judges, priests, and even civilians whose only crime was silence found themselves condemned. Entire families of conspirators were punished, wives sent to camps, children stripped of their names under the cruel doctrine of Sippenhaft, or kin liability. In his headquarters, Hitler signed each death order with increasing bitterness, believing that vengeance was proof of control. Yet, amid the terror, whispers persisted. Some within the army quietly honored the dead as men of conscience. Others burned their letters, destroyed diaries, and swore new oaths to survive. The plot had failed in action, but its echo lingered in the conscience of a nation that had forgotten the meaning of courage. From that morning onward, every soldier and citizen knew that resistance was possible, and that some Germans had indeed dared to defy the Führer.
In the days that followed the failed coup, Joseph Goebbels turned the machinery of propaganda toward a single purpose: to transform treason into a lesson in obedience. Posters appeared overnight across Germany, portraits of Hitler framed by flames, captions reading, "By the mercy of Providence, the Führer lives." Radio commentators thundered about divine intervention, insisting that even destiny had taken sides. What had been a desperate moment of vulnerability was reshaped into a miracle of survival. Newspapers named the conspirators one by one, labeling them cowards, aristocratic traitors, enemies within. Photographs of their corpses were quietly circulated among army units as a warning. Goebbels' ministry produced newsreels showing Hitler inspecting the wreckage of the conference hut, smiling faintly, his uniform torn, his hair singed. The narration described him as calm and unshaken, the embodiment of Germany's eternal will. The message was unmistakable. If the Führer could not be killed by his own generals, he could not be killed at all.
For many Germans, exhausted by war and censorship, the event reinforced fear more than faith. Conversations in cafes and trams fell silent when the plot was mentioned. To ask a question was dangerous, to express sympathy fatal. Yet in private, quiet admiration flickered for the men who had tried, for the idea that conscience still existed somewhere behind the front lines. Among soldiers on leave, the news spread in half-whispers. They almost did it. Within the Wehrmacht, however, the effect was devastating. Hitler no longer trusted his officers. The army, once a pillar of national identity, became an object of suspicion. The SS gained new power as Hitler's personal instrument of vengeance, and loyalty oaths grew harsher. Meetings were shadowed by informants, promotions by fear. The notion of honorable service, central to generations of German soldiers, was replaced by survival. Goebbels' campaign extended even into schools. Teachers told children that enemies of the Führer were enemies of Germany itself. Sermons in churches were monitored. Some clergy who dared to speak of forgiveness were arrested. Propaganda films framed Stauffenberg as a symbol of arrogance and failure, the blind officer who had stabbed the nation in the back. The truth of his motives, his desire to save Germany from ruin, was buried beneath slogans and lies. By late August, the entire narrative of the July 20 plot had been rewritten. It was no longer a rebellion of conscience, but a betrayal crushed by providence. To millions who still listened to the radio each night for news of the front, that distortion became the only story they were allowed to know.
Through autumn 1944, the executions continued with mechanical regularity. Each new week brought fresh trials before Roland Freisler's People's Court, broadcast in fragments to terrify the public. Freisler presided in his blood-red robe, shouting until his voice cracked, pounding the desk with his fists, reducing defendants to silence before sentencing them to death. Proceedings that might once have lasted hours now took minutes. The verdict was always the same. Senior figures of the conspiracy met their end one after another. General Beck, once chief of the General Staff, shot himself in his office after his arrest, his final gesture of defiance. Karl Goerdeler, former mayor of Leipzig and one of the movement's civilian leaders, endured months of interrogation before his execution in February 1945. General Friedrich Fromm, who had tried to conceal his knowledge of the plot by executing Stauffenberg himself, was later implicated and shot as well. The regime devoured even those who had obeyed it. At Plötzensee prison in Berlin, hangings took place in batches. The condemned were stripped of uniforms, their belts replaced with thin piano wire, their deaths filmed for Hitler's personal viewing. Guards described Freisler tending some of the executions, pacing excitedly, shouting insults as the trapdoors opened. The footage was locked away in archives, a macabre trophy of loyalty. By year's end, hundreds of officers, judges, clerics, and civilians had been killed. Still, the purge could not erase the memory of what had nearly happened. In the ruins of bombed cities, civilians spoke carefully of the officers who tried. For some, it was the first sign that not all Germans had followed Hitler blindly. For others, it was a tragedy, proof that resistance had come too late to change the war's outcome. Even among Hitler's closest staff, unease lingered. They had seen how close death had stood at the Führer's side, disguised as a brown briefcase on a summer afternoon. As winter approached, Allied troops pressed deeper into Germany. Hitler's paranoia grew. He moved from one bunker to another, surrounded by a shrinking circle of loyalists. The July 20th plot haunted him. He spoke of it often, railing that Providence had spared him for a purpose. Yet the same sense of destiny that once inspired confidence now seemed to trap him within his own delusion. The Reich he ruled was collapsing, but he refused to see it. The men who had tried to end the nightmare were gone, but their act had carved a line history could never erase. As 1944 turned to 1945, Germany entered its final winter under the weight of collapse. The front lines were disintegrating. Cities lay in ruins, and the once mighty Wehrmacht was retreating on every side. Hitler, increasingly frail and isolated, withdrew deeper into the underground fortress beneath the Reich Chancellery, the Führer bunker. There, surrounded by maps, morphine, and loyal aides, he lived in a twilight of denial. Yet one obsession never left him: the memory of July 20th. The failed assassination haunted him as proof of betrayal within the ranks he once trusted most. He spoke endlessly of it, pacing the concrete halls, insisting that Providence had spared him for a divine mission. To his followers, he repeated that survival was evidence of destiny. To himself, it was both vindication and paranoia. He no longer allowed officers to approach him carrying briefcases. Even the sound of a slammed door could make him flinch. The image of Stauffenberg's calm defiance lingered in his nightmares.
Around him, the empire that once covered Europe was shrinking to a few burning streets. Soviet artillery could already be heard from the eastern suburbs of Berlin. Food and fuel were gone. Civilians wandered the ruins, scavenging among the echoes of speeches and parades that now seemed part of another century. But Hitler refused to surrender. He ordered phantom divisions to counterattack, berated generals who no longer commanded armies, and demanded loyalty from a people who had nothing left to give. The surviving members of the resistance, those who had escaped immediate execution, remained under constant surveillance. Some were hidden by friends, others perished in camps before the war's end. A few, such as Fabian von Schlabrendorf, survived imprisonment and torture to testify later about the conspiracy. Their recollections would become vital in restoring the truth about what had happened that summer. That Germany's resistance had not been an illusion, but a moral stand taken at the darkest hour. By April 1945, the Third Reich was finished. Allied troops advanced from the west. The Red Army closed in from the east. In his final days, Hitler dictated his political testament, still railing against traitors, still blaming the July 20 conspirators for the collapse of his regime. On April 30, as Soviet soldiers fought street by street toward the Chancellery, he ended his life in the bunker he had chosen as his fortress. The man who could not be killed by a briefcase bomb was finally undone by his own hand.
Outside, Berlin burned, a city buried beneath the consequences of its leader's survival. When the guns finally fell silent in May 1945, Germany lay in ruins. Its cities were flattened,
its people displaced, and its name stained by the crimes of a regime that had promised greatness and delivered ruin. Amid the ashes, one question echoed across the occupied zones. Had any Germans tried to stop it? For many, the answer came from a date, 20 July 1944, and from the memory of a man who had stood against tyranny from within. In the immediate post-war years, the conspirators were viewed with complexity. To some Germans, conditioned by years of propaganda, they were still seen as traitors. Others began to understand their motives, that Stauffenberg and his companions had not sought power for themselves, but salvation for their country. As documents emerged and trials revealed the full horror of the regime, public opinion slowly shifted. The men and women of the resistance came to symbolize a moral awakening, proof that even inside Hitler's Germany, conscience had survived. The Bendler block, once the scene of their execution, was preserved as a place of remembrance. Each year, on the anniversary of the plot, officials and citizens gathered in its courtyard to honor the courage of those who had acted when obedience was easier. Photographs of Stauffenberg, Tresckow, Olbricht, and their companions were displayed alongside excerpts from their letters, words that spoke of duty, faith, and responsibility. One line from Tresckow's final note captured the spirit of them all. The attempt must be made, whatever the cost. Even if it fails, we must act to show that not all Germans are like him. In the decades that followed, historians reassessed the July 20 plot not as a mere footnote, but as a turning point in moral history. It was no longer the story of failure, but of integrity. The conspirators had failed to kill Hitler, but they had succeeded in proving that resistance was possible, that conscience could exist even under absolute tyranny. Their defiance stood as the last flicker of Germany's honor before the final collapse. Today, the legacy of the July 20 plot endures, not through monuments alone, but through the idea that silence in the face of evil is itself a form of complicity. In every era since, those who study that day, when a single briefcase nearly changed the course of the world, are reminded that moral courage often stands alone, unarmed and unguaranteed of victory. Yet it is the one act that history never forgets.